from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the sixth program in our 8-week series entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. On the sixth program, we're going to be discussing the historical human quest for spirituality and religious philosophical meaning to life. We're so pleased to welcome to our program Dr. George Freen, who is a professor of religion and philosophy at the University of North Dakota. He holds a PhD degree in religion from the Catholic University of America. Our guest has also been the director of the Great Plains Chautauqua Society, and he was here with us last year in the role of Mark Twain. And actually today we're going to be interviewing Henry Brooks Adams, that is being portrayed by our distinguished guest. Henry Brooks Adams lived from 1838 until 1918. Mr. Adams was an American historian and the son of Charles Francis Adams and the descendant of 2 presidents of the United States. He gradually abandoned his family's involvement in politics to pursue the study of history. Mr. Adams was a graduate of Harvard, and he traveled abroad as secretary to his father and learned much about Europe and philosophy and religion in Europe. He also taught at Harvard and became the editor of the North American Review. He wrote a 9-volume publication that was entitled History of the United States, 1989 to 1991. In 1885, his wife's suicide led him to further search of what we're talking about, of philosophy and the meaning of life, after her death in 1885. Mr. Adams, welcome to our program, and we've had a lot of historical figures over the last 2 years, and
thank you.
We're very pleased to have you as our guest, and as always, I'm very pleased to have Janelle Burke, who is a regular panelist, and we shall ask Janelle to commence our discussion with this historical figure, Henry Brooks Adams.
Mr. Adams, you certainly grew up in an impressive family.
Yes.
There must have been some things, though, along the way that had an impact on your determination to study history as opposed to some of the other things that your family was involved in. What were those impacts?
Well, the family is the big one. Of course, my education was planned for me by my great-grandparents, John and Abigail, the remarkable Abigail Adams. John wrote to his wife Abigail that my sons must study war and politics so that their sons may study philosophy and mathematics, so that their sons may study art and poetry and sculpture and tapestry. And I'm a 4th generation Adams. So my education and the plans for it go back a long, long way in the family, and they're a very religious family, too.
What kind of religion? What kind of religious
Well, they were good
background?
old New England Puritans, you understand, which explains a lot. But it was always a puzzle to me that the second great passion, second only to sex, that the human family has long been exercised about, passed away in my generation. Neither my sisters, nor my brothers, nor I had any interest in it. I think because the Boston Unitarian clergy solved everything that was a question in the world. You know, that old Boston green mold that lies over everything in Boston. And so, though I went to church, though I memorized verses in the Bible and religious poetry, when I came to be an adult and out on my own, it just wasn't there.
So as you began to search, you began to look for something more than what you previously had been taught. Was that a conflict?
Oh, yes. Well, and you know, so many things that we had been taught. For example, we had been taught that women were inferior, So I used to have the dinners. You know, I had that house next to John Hayes on Lafayette Square. I could look over out my front window and watch what was going on in the White House. Just knowing that Teddy Roosevelt's over there pacing back and forth makes me nervous and pessimistic. But I would have Washington society, and when the conversation flagged, I would ask one of my loveliest neighbors why it was that American women were such a failure. And the brighter they were, the faster they'd answer, because the American man is such a failure. And of course the men would all object, because their wives were above average. But I pointed out to them that they were above all possible average, and still their wives were better than they. Why, nobody would elect Teddy against Mrs. Roosevelt. And Senator Lodge would be defeated by his wife every time. And my brother Brooks' wife would make 3 or 4 of Brooks's. Anyway, then one, and I was pessimistic about the world. You know, things are, always expect the worst. And it's always worse than I expect. And in one of these moods, Mrs. Lodge, the senator's wife, invited me to follow her to Europe with the senator and their sons. And so where she bid, I would go. And I found myself one summer in July in Normandy, and for all practical purposes back in the 13th century. And what I discovered was a time when woman was a force in the world, and you could see it in all the cathedrals, dominated by the woman. She gave the orders to society. And so my search was for the truth, and of course as a teacher who affects eternity. I mean, parents only give life, but teachers can affect eternity. As a teacher, I was interested in the truth, and when I taught at Harvard, I thought that if you found the legal basis on which society was built, you'd know that society. And I found that base when I taught medieval history. Then I went with Mrs. Lodge and found out I was completely wrong. I made a failure of my 7 years of teaching, because it wasn't the law that governed society, it was the woman, it was the virgin. And so I, for years, spent half the year in France, in 12th century attics with monks and nuns and cathedrals, and then half the year in Washington, keeping an eye on the presidents. You had to look around that equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson, who cheated my great-grandfather, John Quincy, out of his second term in the White House. Anyway, I studied very seriously the Middle Ages and was interested not only in the cathedrals, but also St. Thomas's great Summa, which seemed to me a construction like the cathedrals. My nieces, many of them, became Catholic. One night they all got together and invited the rector of the Catholic University to come to my table for dinner. And he did. But I cautioned them afterwards, don't do that again. Might cause the good man to lose his faith, as I had and continued to have.
Mr. Adams, you were so affected by not only your upbringing and the being a member of the prominent Adams family, and your education, your teaching, but the death of your wife by suicide really affected you. And I opened the program by indicating that you had written the 9-volume series called History of the United States, and I think I misspoke in introducing that. It was 1889 to 1891.
It was the Jefferson and Madison administration, those 16 years.
Yes. And so I wanted to know what was the significance of the particular time period in relation to this development that you were going through concerning history, and how you were moving from the legal perspective and all into the philosophical questions and the spirituality.
Well, of course, when you deal with the Founding Fathers, you're not far from philosophy at any time, certainly not Jefferson, nor Madison, nor the Adamses. I was once asked the question, Jefferson had a dream of an agrarian democracy, and Hamilton had an American vision of a commercial power. Which vision did the Adams have? And I said, they had their own. A republic of virtue. That was what the Adams vision was. And of course, my great-grandfather, John Adams, was the second president, first vice president, the second president, the first one to live in the White House. But of course I didn't identify him that way in my history. I simply talked about Mr. Jefferson's predecessor. But it was that time in which our country was formed. And so that's of great importance and interest to us. And then, of course, I was interested in both of those gentlemen because I suppose I saw something of myself in them. It was ironic that Jefferson, this strict constructionist of the Constitution, if there was ever a man you could elect for 2 terms and he would keep his promises, you'd think it would be Thomas Jefferson, not a minute. Within the first term, he bought Louisiana. There's no authorization in the Constitution for either Congress or the President to do that, and he knew it. Said it makes a piece of paper out of the Constitution, but it was too good a buy to pass up.
Even though you lived later, and like I indicated when I entered this
Historians always do.
Yes, they surely do, don't they? Even though you lived from 1838 to 1918, you were going back and looking at the Jeffersonian and Adams conflicts. Were you at all affected by the fact that Thomas Jefferson and President Adams, John Adams, they went through a period of being very unfriendly, although they later were friends. It was a struggle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists?
That's right. That's right. The Federalists were Washington and Adams, and any decent man would have allowed Mr. Adams to have a second term, but not Jefferson. He had to intrude. And just as Andrew Jackson did later when there was an Adams in the White House, it seemed to be the Adams family tradition to have only one term.
This challenge from the other forces, the Anti-Federalists. I want to talk a little bit about the spirituality, since we're so limited in the time we have with you. I sense from your works and your comments that you went through some major changes in your life. Would you share with our viewers your concept of spirituality and how complex some of those questions are, or maybe share some questions with us?
Well, it is a complex subject, yet it defines us as human beings. We have those great questions. We cannot all deal with them. John Adams would dearly have loved to have had the leisure that his nemesis Thomas Jefferson did to meditate, to think philosophically, but he was a lawyer. He had to defend clients. And not only that, he had to found a republic. While Mr. Jefferson, incidentally, was off in Europe philosophizing.
And reading.
And reading, that's right, and gaining some, whatever you can gain from French culture. Anyway, he knew that that was something that the family had to do if it was to be what he wanted it to be. And so my brothers and I have had philosophical, though we tend to be rather skeptical, rather doubtful. I would dearly have loved to have been a philosophical determinist. It seems to me that the world has us in its grip, and it acts on us. We don't act ourselves. And I would have believed that, believed in historical determinancy and fate. Except I'm an Adams. I'm a Puritan, and I need somebody to blame when things go wrong. And you can't blame somebody if you're just in the grip of determining forces in history. And as we come into the 20th century, with the discovery of radiation and the powers that we have, physical powers that we have in our hands, you know, it used to be the old industrial powers of agriculture, handiwork, and learning. And now that's all changed. It's coal, iron, and steel, and we measure that, doubling it up every decade. But for what purpose? If we don't double up mind power to get a hold on it. And now with radiation, why, the world could blow itself up if it doesn't double up its mind capacity.
I hear you struggling between the history of the Addams family and what they believed religiously and changes in the
Yes.
world as you lived even into the 20th century. Would you put forth some troubling questions that you've wrestled with, particularly later in your life?
Well, the one I was just talking about, human progress and development, is it really progress? I mean, the World's Fair, and I am a devout believer in World's Fair. I've been to the Paris Exposition, the Chicago Exposition, and the St. Louis World's Fair. And in St. Louis, the third-rate town, lit up the night sky with 1,000 electric candles. But are electric candles progress? Well, it depends on what you do under them, I suppose. That is a great question. Everybody seems to believe in progress, but I'm not so sure. I'm a conservative Christian anarchist.
Would you explain that to us, what you mean by that?
Well, I think the terms are mutually exclusive, but conservative and anarchist don't fit very well, and Christian doesn't fit sandwiched between them very well, so it's a kind of puzzle, but that's just the way I am. After all, I'm the family failure. I mean, my grandfathers governed the country. Nobody even appointed me to any job. But what happened from the time of my grandfather's funeral? The Irish gardener went with us, the funeral, and he took care of me afterwards on the way home. He said, Mr. Henry, I suppose you'll expect to be president yourself someday. Well, the doubt in that man's mind about the fact was the first time it had ever occurred to me that there should be any doubt about it, but it proved to be true. I've never even given advice to presidents. So as I say, I'm the family failure. All I've tried to do is understand the country. And it seems to me the country is a great question. Whether or not we will continue to be a republic of virtue, or even want to be, is a great question. The great questions are really not private questions, but public questions. And that depends so much on education, and that's why I think I'm fitted for my life. Because in a sense, unlike my grandfathers, I never had a life. I only had an education. But that's what we all need. That if there's any answer anywhere, it's in an education. So I wrote my autobiography. I called it The Education of Henry Adams, and I offer it to young men at colleges and universities as a way to see the world and what's needed in the world. I say that in the introduction that Henry Cabot Lodge wrote for the publication of my autobiography. I couldn't trust him to write it just that way himself, so I wrote it for him. And the education is really, I suppose, my response to not so much the personal problems, and I've had my own, as we all do, but the great public issues and what you need to see the issues. What's at issue in America is someplace else. You need someplace else to stand. That's why I went to the 12th century and found a place there from which I could measure my time. And the century, 1170 to 1270, provided such a wonderful place to stand. You know, at Mont Saint-Michel, in the crypt, and at Chartres in the crypt, the stones are cut with the precision that the stones above ground that could be seen were cut. In the later cathedrals, just 100 years later, they didn't chisel the foundation stones well at all because nobody would see them. You see how early things began to go wrong, to go downhill. And then, of course, when you get to America in recent years with Teddy in the White House over there pacing back and forth, things have gone down fast.
Janelle Burke.
You have been a great student of history, and you mentioned your trip.
Not that anybody ever read it. You know, I think I lost $95,000 on writing that history over all of those years, and as far as I know, I only had 3 readers.
But you've also been a great observer of
Yes.
humankind.
Oh,
You
yes.
wonderful observer. What do you believe is the thing within us that makes us search for spirituality, that makes us search for meaning in life? Why is that so important?
Well, you know, an editor out in Kansas wrote about me. He said, Henry Adams is the only man in the world that can sit on a fence and watch himself go by. I think within us that that's not a difficult thing to do. Everybody who writes their autobiography. And I think you ought to not only write your autobiography, you should write your epithet too. That lets you get on with your posthumous existence early. So years ago I wrote my epithet and have been living posthumously ever since. But I think anyone who has any curiosity about himself or his neighbors will engage in such an exercise. Now, maybe not write it all out, you know, and bore your friends and neighbors with it, as I did, but will think about themselves, the successes, but mostly the failures that they've made in life, the tragedies, the awful things that you cannot ever speak about afterwards. These things cause us to be reflective, cause us to pause, cause us to find someplace else where we can go and be at home and measure our own time and our own lives, so that that we get an objective view, a good view, a historian's view of ourselves. Apart from history, there is no knowledge, there is no truth. Everything is historical. Everything happened at some time, in some place, in somewhere. And what we need to remind ourselves of, since we're all egoists, is that that view is not true. That view is not right. We need to see ourselves in a larger picture.
And just out of curiosity, what kind of epithet did you write for yourself, in general?
Hic jacet, and so on in Latin. Here lies the little scribbler, Henry Adams, a descendant of Adam and Eve who discovered Socnam. You've not heard of it. Socnam is an English legal term that I found in the Middle Ages. I thought it explained something. Just insignificant when you put it next to the cathedral. That's what Mrs. Lodge showed me. But it allowed me to get on with the rest of my existence, my posthumous existence. And I would advise you also, write your own autobiography. I've read many biographies, and let me tell you, a biography lends new terror to death. You tell the story of yourself so that others won't.
I have to just ask you one more question. What do you think is happening to the moral fabric of this country, particularly as time has passed?
Well, it's not only this country, it is the Western world. The rumors of war in Europe, and the war. And America is now ready to participate in that war. It makes me wonder about human survivability, human sanity, but many men, many young men, or my niece's friends, for example, very nobly and courageously have enlisted. I'm not one of those pessimists who would say, I told you so, but I did.
We hear in modern times, and as you're visiting with us from the past, we hear a lot about religion, the term that we are using in this particular program, and philosophy, and then spirituality. Do you see differences in those terms? Is there something different about just the basic human spirit or spirituality as it relates to organized activities such as religion?
Well, I think that the human being is an organized animal, is a person who lives in organizations. Not sure what disorganized religion would be like. I don't have, but certainly medieval religion was highly organized. A high hierarchy organized it all. Somebody had to lift the stones, and somebody had to sing while others lifted the stones, and somebody had to govern while others sang and lifted the stones, and so on. So I suppose religion will always be organized. Those who don't engage in organized religion soon don't engage in religion at all, I suppose. But I myself have never been comfortable with organized religion, but I haven't been comfortable with I've not been comfortable with disorganized religion or vague spiritualities. Eileen Tone is taking care of me these days, and I told her, don't you dare take me to St. John's Church dead, when I never darkened that door alive.
Because of your real philosophical depth, would you share with our viewers what you believe would be the most important message that could be given to people about the meaning of life, or what are we doing here, or what do you think would be most beneficial as a human while on the planet?
Well, I'm a historian, and so I would say that anyone who wants to understand life must understand it as a historical process. Cannot see it apart from that. Now, there are many people who try to speak the truth as though it's final and absolute. And it's never final and absolute, because they're going to die someday, and somebody's going to come along and correct what they said, or improve it, or forget it. So all things philosophical must also be historical. But the historian, of course, doesn't know everything. For example, the historian, especially the American historian, knows nothing about women. That's why you find they're never in his pages. Why the monks in the Middle Ages knew more about women than the scientist or the historian does today. I've written 2 novels with female protagonists. Well, they were both failures, not because of the women, but because there was nothing that they could do in society. They couldn't govern, as in the case of my novel, Democracy, nor could they practice art, publicly at least, as in the case of Esther, the second novel. So the problem is to find a society where they can function. And for that you must go back to the Middle Ages to find a place where women, or a woman, functioned, and not only functioned, but governed.
On that note, I want to bring the program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, we want to thank Henry Brooks Adams for being here as portrayed by Dr. George Frein. We appreciate it so much. It's been most informative and in-depth. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite you to be with us again next week when we will do program number 7 in this 8-week series entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. We certainly hope and believe you're enjoying this series, and please join us again, as I said, next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.